Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 18th episode of Off the Cuff. Now, today I'm going to be talking about this interesting thing I've discovered a few months back, and I thought, I've missed the train. It's been a while. I should probably just not bother talking about it. But given some recent things, well, I say recent, just the end of last year, some interesting events occurred. I thought it gave me a reason to bring up this topic again. So today I want to talk about the contributor covenant. Now, you might be wondering, well, what it is. So I will just point out this is a bit of a developer-oriented video, but I think this is relevant to anyone who's interested in open source platforms, just basically social justice warrior ideology making its way into development. So, yeah. This is what it's all about, really. The contributor covenant is typically a code of conduct for open source projects. And the interesting thing about it is it's quite crazy, actually. So normally when you're doing development, you don't usually worry about traits of the developers, but this code of conduct makes it very much relevant. So you can hear all the sorts of usual language here about marginalized people and making assumptions about gender or race, reinforcing stereotypes, using sexualized or otherwise inappropriate language. Basically the usual kind of virtue signaling kind of rubbish a lot of social justice warriors. The language that social justice warriors use to make their way into most circles by sounding very accepting and inclusive. But, they say things such as, it says here that open source projects suffer from a startling lack of diversity with dramatically low representation by women, people of color, and other marginalized populations. Of course, not accounting for the fact that women just aren't as interested in coding. They're just generally not. It's not what's interesting to them. And I would know because I try to talk to all sorts of people about it, and I've got plenty of sisters in my family, and none of them are interested in any of any coding or computer related stuff that I talk about. So yeah, the contributor covenant is basically a really rather, well, it's sort of a, let's put it, it's an expansive set of tools, really. So I'm going to move on to, first I want to talk about the creator because it's important to understand where it's come from. So the contributor covenant was created by someone named Caroline Ada MK. I'm not even sure that's how you say her surname, but I don't really care. Unsurprisingly, he, I don't know, has lines in here like, I work diligently to promote diversity and inclusivity in open source and the tech industry. Now, it says here, I was recognized for my work with the Ruby Hero Award. Now, I'm not so sure how important or relevant. No, that's not the word I'm looking for. I'm not sure how meaningful that award really is, and I'll explain why later. So, Caroline hasn't just created the contributor covenant. She also serves on the board of directors for Ruby Together, which is a non-profit that funds development of critical Ruby infrastructure like rubygems.org. Now, an important thing there is that it's a non-profit that funds development. It doesn't run it. And we'll get to that later as well, because that's going to be very relevant. But first, let's break down what the code of conduct of the contributor covenant that all these different software platforms are adopting is all about. So I'm just going to read through this. In the interest of fostering an open and welcoming environment, we as contributors and maintainers pledge to make participation in our projects and our community a harassment-free experience for everyone, regardless of age, body size, disability, ethnicity, sex characteristics, gender identity, and expression, level of experience, education, socio-economic status, nationality, personal appearance, race, religion, or sexual identity and orientation. So basically all sorts of individual traits that any person might have. Now, as a developer, I've worked in many various projects. I work as a contractor, so I get thrown around all sorts of different companies. And I can tell you, I can see why this might be relevant because, you might, if you're a dumbass, think that some of these things might come up sometimes. But with all the different developers I've worked with from all over the world and of all sorts of different individual characteristics, I have had that's been relevant to the code that they write 0 times. It has never had any impact on the code they write, and has never had any impact on how I read their code. Now, yes, you could say that maybe I would have some sort of prejudice on sometimes on certain things. That would be rather easy to spot, let's put it that way. It's easy to identify when someone's being bigoted. And I would say I've never been bigoted. Now, they've got here in the next section here, our standards. Examples of behavior that contributes to creating a positive environment, I say in quotes, include using welcoming and inclusive language, being respectful of differing viewpoints and experiences, gracefully accepting constructive criticism, focusing on what is best for the community, showing empathy towards other community members. Now, there's one line in there that is important, gracefully accepting constructive criticism. But that has absolutely nothing to do with the opening statement on all the different individual characteristics. That's just behavioral. If because as a developer, yeah, you have to get used to different criticism. But I think a lot of this, one of the big problems that happened is you have some developers who are very difficult to work with, and that's why a lot of these code of conducts get adopted. It kind of offers the perfect way of expanding the reach of the contributor covenant by getting all sorts of people to adopt it, because they've got difficult developers that they need to kind of push into being more friendly with other developers. Now it gets a little more interesting here. Examples of unacceptable behavior by participants include the use of sexualized language or imagery and unwelcome sexual attention or advances. I'm sure that comes up very often when you're committing or doing a pull request on code, right? And when you're trying to give feedback to some piece of code, I'm sure that's the perfect time to flirt, right? Trolling, insulting, derogatory comments, and personal or political attacks. Now that lumps in many different things. So trolling and insulting and derogatory comments, those can happen. You can have developers starts swearing and all sorts at you because you just gave him some feedback on his code. That can happen. But personal political attacks is kind of, well, yeah, I can guess it, but it gets a bit weird with political attacks because politics very rarely has any bearing on any code you write. I've never written a piece of code and someone goes, "Oh, that's such a Republican piece of code." No, that's just it's just not going to happen. It's never relevant. If you're working on a political website or like a journalist website or something, it might come up. It's possible, but very unlikely. Now this next one, yes, it's relevant. Public or private harassment. That can happen. That is something I would definitely say is cautious. But this is what a lot of social justice warrior stuff does: is they lump together lots of stuff that sounds nice, and they just sneak in little bits of wording and phrasing and notes and points that, if you don't pay too much attention to, they sound right. They sound reasonable. You can just skim over them. But if you actually unpack what's involved there, it starts to seem a bit more. It starts to seem a bit more suspicious. And the stuff about the individual traits, the unwelcome sexual attention or advances, you might say, okay, yeah, that's that is relevant. But guess what? That's also in law. Unwelcome sexual attention or advances. There's all sorts of laws around that kind of stuff. But yeah. Anyway, finally, there's 2 more points here. Publishing others' private information, such as physical or electronic addresses, without explicit permission. Okay, so that's doxing. That's also fair, I suppose. Other conduct which could reasonably be considered inappropriate in a professional setting. Now, this one is interesting because it's just added as like a footnote. Other conduct which could reasonably. Now, what's reasonably? Who decides what's reasonable? Who decides what's considered inappropriate? Now, this is where the next point comes in. This is where who decides. Our responsibilities. Project maintainers are responsible for clarifying the standards of acceptable behavior and are expected to take appropriate and fair corrective action in response to any instances of unacceptable behavior. Now, the problem with that, of course, again, is that you've got the project maintainers who are responsible and they've got to take the corrective action. So they've got to decide what's acceptable and what isn't. But it all depends on who's maintaining the project. And sometimes, they may be pushed out if certain people make their way into the code maintenance. Project maintainers have the right and responsibility to remove, edit, or reject comments, commits, code, wiki edits, issues, and other contributions that are not aligned to this code of conduct. And here's the big one, or to ban, temporarily or permanently, any contributor for other behaviors they deem inappropriate, threatening, offensive, or harmful. Now again, you've got there whether they deem it inappropriate, threatening, offensive, or harmful. Now you could say, if someone was being very difficult, you're not working with them, there's a reason to ban them. Of course, you can just prevent them from contributing their code. You could just, just reject it. But it all depends on the kind of person. But the contributor covenant loves to expand the reach. And the reason I brought up that Caroline Ada MK earlier is because if she were a project maintainer, there's some conduct that has been pretty suspicious. But let me just finish this first, because I'll go over some of the stuff that Caroline's done previously. So scope. Now this is the important part. The scope is, where are the borders of the code of conduct defined? Where does it limit? Is it everywhere? Your personal life? Is something you say to some bartender in a bar, is that going to be counted towards your code? Is that going to be counted as harassment if you do something there? Well, let's find out. This code of conduct applies within all project spaces. And it also applies when an individual is representing the project or its community in public spaces. Now, you're going to have to define, are they just representing it by having committed code previously? Examples of representing, okay, here we go. So examples of representing a project or community include using an official project email address, okay, posting via an official social media account. Now, is that official as in a personal one or official as in one for the project? That's a good question there. So, or acting as an appointed representative at an online or offline event. Representation of a project may be further defined and clarified by project maintainers. That is again giving more power to the project maintainers. Enforcement, the next section. Instances of abusive, harassing, and otherwise unacceptable behavior may be reported by contacting the project team at, and then it's got insert email address. Yeah. All complaints will be reviewed and investigated and will result in a response that is deemed necessary and appropriate to the circumstances. The project team is obligated to maintain confidentiality with regards to the reporter of an incident. Further details of specific enforcement policies may be posted separately. Project maintainers who do not follow or enforce code of conduct in good faith may face temporary or permanent repercussions as determined by other members of the project's leadership. So that's the contributor code of covenant, which has spread quite far. Now, frankly, I think that they've got too much power there. It's interesting that project maintainers who do not follow or enforce a code of conduct, that they may face temporary or permanent repercussions. I do wonder, would this apply to every project maintainer, including people who created or worked with closely with the contributor code of covenant? Contributor covenant, sorry. Well, let's just look into it a bit more. So, the contributor covenant started growing a while back. They started doing their little nitpicks and trying to just change code where it's not necessarily useful. So here on this project, libuv, they wanted to change some comments, not even parts of the code, just comments. Where you're just advising, and if you're not a developer, this is just, where you're just adding in a little tip, little bit of info that doesn't affect the code and is just for other developers who read the code. So they had here the line, read errors are reported if nsent equals 0, otherwise we return nsent. Okay, it says here, the user needs to know that some data has already been sent to stop him from sending it twice. And they've now changed, they wanted to change the code here, them from sending it twice, to them from sending it twice, sorry. And then another line here said, blah, 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 is our only way to signal to the user that he should stop writing, which he should if we got an error. And they've changed it to they should stop writing, which they should. So change it to the they instead of the gendered pronouns. And this is back in 2013. And it was I think this was one of the first instances where they started trying to expand. Then a couple years later, they started to grow. They started to get some more weight, have some more backing, and feel a little more confident as they do. So one such example would have been here. Now this guy over here, Elia, he was a project contributor, no, actually a core contributor, I think they're called, for a project called Opal. I don't work with it too much, but I believe it was something that worked between Ruby, which is a coding language, and JavaScript, another coding language. So it kind of interface between them, but I'm not an expert on that. So there's a conversation going on, and someone here said that trans people are treated like shit constantly. And he says, maybe that's just a legit opinion. I still fail to see how that kind of invasive surgery on kids can be cherished. And then he added, anyway, it's months in that Italy school after school sneaks genderism lessons in without parents' consent. Not cool. So that's something that's become very relevant where, the LGBT lessons are starting to kind of get stuck in there. And then this guy responded, I don't know enough about Italian politics to say, but if you think trans people aren't accepting reality, it's probably BS. So this Elia guy is basically just saying that he's kind of criticizing the fact that he doesn't think they should cherish invasive surgery on kids, and he doesn't like them sneaking in LGBT lessons. That's what he said there. And, you would think nothing much of that. But, lo and behold, here on this update here, update contributor covenant to include ethnicity on the Opal codebase. So this is where on Opal had adopted the contributor covenant. And this guy Meh is let's say it's quite based. So they wanted to add to the code of conduct. This code of conduct applies both within project spaces and in public spaces when an individual is representing the project or its community. So basically, they were wanting to expand the code of conduct to apply in public spaces, and you'd wonder why are they trying to expand the code of conduct there. Now, Mayor has said here, this is too ambiguous to me. And someone here has added, this is too stupid to me. And here's where it goes interesting. This person who's written the code, I believe, no, actually, so someone else has responded here. Mel the Adorable has said, this is a necessary change. Version 1.0 of the Contributor Covenant fails to address the situation which started this. The gross misconduct of one of your core maintainers, spewing a veritable amount of hate and ignorance about LGBT people on social media platform, where he constantly ties himself to your project and refers to himself as a core maintainer. So this is obviously a while back. This must be before the Contributor Covenant had adopted that whole bit about representing your community. So Mayor has here responded here, he's defending, and he says, I've already stated that he has the right to do so. He wasn't interacting with anyone within the project. He's free to express himself however he feels outside of Opal. The fact he's an Opal core contributor is public on the organization's page. So it's irrelevant if he puts in his profile that he is one, especially since he is one. So Mayor's actually been quite reasonable here because he's just saying, the guys have a conversation. And obviously this is going back to the guy we were just talking about, Elia. That's who they're talking about. He wasn't, he was having a conversation outside of any of this Opal coding related stuff. But they were trying to apply the code of conduct to him. So this Mel the Adorable then turns around and says, your conduct has been at issue too. You have been obstinate, hostile, dismissive, and you told the author of the code of conduct we're discussing, Caroline, that she wasn't capable of making meaningful open source contributions yesterday. We'll get to that in just a bit. And he added here, I said, I'm just cutting out most of it. I said that Caroline isn't capable of contributing the way Elia has been contributing, which apparently is true if all Caroline can do is write code of conducts. That's a very spicy comment there. Now, let's go on to that little comment I've just mentioned about the where he had mentioned yesterday. So here, Caroline has posted, transphobic maintainer should be removed from project, referring to Elia Shito. So she says here, Elia Shito is publicly calling trans people out for not accepting reality on Twitter. His Twitter profile mentions that he is a core contributor to Opal. Is this what the other maintainers want to be reflected in the project? Will any transgender developers feel comfortable contributing? So they're literally the only way that they're relating and joining up the fact that he was publicly representing them is the fact that in his Twitter profile it mentions that he's a core contributor. He's not mentioning it in the conversation at hand. It's like if I say I'm from the United Kingdom, I'm not representing the United Kingdom in every conversation I have just because it's in my profile. So Mayor, this is now the day before those other comments, Mayor has said here, if you want him removed, start working on Opal, contributing as much as him to everything he did for Opal, so we have a replacement that's more in orientation with your morals and views. Pro tip, you won't because you can't. And then he closed the issue. So what he's saying here is, Caroline, it's actually Caroline, I haven't said Caroline. Caroline has said, Mayor said to Caroline, you are going to have to prove your worth because Elia is actually contributing to the project. He's being useful. He's helping. He's given merit. And Caroline isn't actually contributing. She's not helping. Now, he elaborates. Also, to elaborate more on that, Opal is a technology. Technology is moralless. That's damn straight. If a transgender contributor appeared, Elia's views wouldn't even appear in here. Because why would anyone care? Bring contributions, they will be accepted with open arms. Bring morals and politics in here, and you'll be shown the metaphorical door. And then this person, Strand, came in and says, as a queer person, this sort of argument from a maintainer makes me feel unwelcome. The ignorance which Elia shows by claiming that trans folk are not accepting reality is actively harmful. I will not contribute to this project or any other project which Elia maintains. Now, last I checked, by the way, the Strand has continued to contribute. Anyway, so the conversation goes a bit wild after that. But this is interesting here. So Caroline has said here, to meh and others who think that OSS, I don't know what OSS is a moral-free zone. Look at this, the model view culture.com, the dehumanizing myth of the meritocracy. That's a piece from here by Caroline. Now, I read something interesting about model view culture, that one of their creators is a rather, let's say, divisive figure. Get the figures. I'll get the result on that in just a moment. I'm just having to look it up quickly. Yes, there was a person who actually commented on this whole issue, and yeah, I'm trying to make sure I can find it now. I don't think I'll be able to. Second. There you go. I think I found it. It's basically the CEO and founder of Model View Culture is someone named Shanley Kane. And Shanley Kane tweeted this lovely comment. Men disgust me, spits, and then said trash, trash, trash. A very, very friendly comment from a not so friendly person, really. Anyway, so yeah, that conversation didn't go so well. But then a couple years later, the obviously they continued to grow, and it got to the point where eventually Caroline requested that they get adopted over the entire Ruby language. Now, becoming a code of conduct for an entire language is a big deal. Because then any person who wants to grow and add to that code base, like that language, is then, has to adhere to that code of conduct. It's one thing if it's just one project. It's a whole different thing if it's an entire language. Because then, if you're writing code in that language, it can get a bit wild. Thankfully, I don't write in Ruby yet. I was going to learn it, and reading about all this has really turned me against it, especially with Ruby Together's control. But we'll get to Ruby Together later on. And then last year, this is why I'm bringing this up now. Last year, September, Linux, the Linux kernel, which forms as the base for all different branches of Linux, they adopted the contributor covenant, or at least a code of conduct that's based on the contributor covenant. A lot of people were not happy. Not happy. Not happy at all. Now, apparently, Linus Torvald, the creator of Linux, he took a break from Linux kernel development 30 minutes after signing the code of conduct. And yeah, a lot of people are not happy. They're really not happy about this becoming the code of conduct for Linux. You can obviously see all the usual language of why this contributor covenant was adopted. All the usual language of why they use a kind of the whole thing about the characteristics. Really, it's brought in the usual in the interest of fostering an open and welcoming environment, we as contributors and maintainers pledge to making the participation blah 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 with all the usual characteristics. But you notice how they've got some important ones in there about socioeconomic status. That's an interesting one. Then you got like gender identity and expression, level of experience. That's an interesting one. As a coder, yeah, you can understand you don't want people harassing them because they're a beginner in code. But then again, if you're writing a professional project, you want people to, I don't know. I think some sort of tough criticism is important sometimes. Now, you wonder what was the oh so professional Caroline's response to the Linux kernel being adopted? Well, she said, "I can't wait for the mass exodus from Linux, now that it's been infiltrated by SJWs. Ha 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 ha." So that was a very, very professional response. Now, a lot of people, were getting all steamed up about this whole thing, and they were saying, that code of conduct, it isn't political, it's just about making sure we foster an open environment. But Caroline was kind enough to clarify it for us. Some people are saying that the contributor covenant is a political document, and they're right. So there you have it. That was Caroline's response to all of that. And this is why it's wrong. Because when you're writing code, politics rarely has any influence over the code you write. It's all logical. Coding is literally logical lines, of different methodologies. You've got different ways of writing. The different methodologies might be different based on your personality. Some methodologies are based on the structure of your code, how you're wording everything, how you're writing everything, but that's just all down to maybe you prefer strict structures, maybe you prefer looser code. The language you use will change that. The methodology again, the frameworks potentially. And again, the code of conduct can influence the code you write, but not politically. Having a code of conduct that requires strict commenting and tough, critiques, that's one thing. But, based on the developer, code of conduct should not be based on the developer's traits, anything about the developer. It's their code that matters, not who they are. The work speaks for itself. But I wouldn't expect an SJW to understand. So just a month later after that, Linux adopted the code of conduct, and many developers had actually threatened to pull out their code, which was a rather dangerous threat. I don't know what happened to that, and I've tried to look it up, can't find anything. But then Intel's open source projects also adopted the contributor covenant. Now this is 1st of November, just last year. Now this is very, very worrying. Very worrying because they're just expanding their influence further and further. And once something becomes so ingrained, it's really difficult. Really difficult to unravel. And this is why when I look at the adopters list on the website, I truly worry. Because you got in here things like Atom, which is actually the IDE I use, the editor I use to write my code. You got things like Babel, which I use a lot. There's AngularJS, which is a framework I use a lot. Cake is another one I use. Got on here quite a few different applications. And there's Cucumber, which is a testing application. You got Rails, which is a framework for Ruby, so no surprise there. You got Eclipse, which is another editor. Electron, which the Discord and Slack applications both use Electron. They're both based on Electron. You got GitLab, which is a publication tool. It's very not publication tool. It's an editing platform service. Google have adopted the contributor covenant. You've got Also React, I believe. I think it's actually further up. I scrolled down past it. Okay, so React hasn't. That's a good thing. My mistake there. Quite sure I saw them. You got Kubernetes in there. Vue.JS. Now, Angular is actually used by many Google applications. Vue.js is also used by quite a few. So these are probably the applications behind most of the tools you use every day. I mean, I say it probably doesn't affect you much because the code of conduct doesn't affect the users of the site. But for the developers, this is a big deal. It's a big deal indeed because these are going to affect how the code gets written, developers, and of course, if the contributor covenant kicks out any dissenting voices, which it does. It's like it kicked out this Elia guy because he refused to adhere to the transgender ideology, really. And because of that, they managed to kick out offending developers. And if they can kick out offending developers, that'll affect the code that gets written and affects how the code gets written, how the application gets built. And as that goes on, you're going to end up having applications that are more adhering to the social justice warrior movement, which will then affect the terms and conditions of the tools itself. Now, I'm glad to see that React's not in there. React is built by Facebook, I believe. So seeing React that's not in there is somewhat reassuring, but it's only a matter of time. I'm quite sure of that because Facebook have shown that they're quite happy to adhere to the progressive ideas. Now, moving on to Ruby Together, it's an interesting team with some suspicious members and some suspicious actions in the past. Now, Caroline is on the board of directors here, and one of the interesting characters I've looked into is a guy on the board alumni who's also the executive directing member, Andre Arco. Now, Andre Arco is he's not a friendly guy, but he's worked quite heavily with Caroline. I've seen quite a few things. Now, this chap here has declined funding Ruby Together, and if we go based on his opening statement here, he says the published goal of Ruby Together is to build community-funded developer infrastructure, along with perhaps less clearly stated but often communicated goal to increase the diversity of the people participating in Ruby's core open source by providing funding is great. It's hard to disagree with that mission statement, and the impact of some of that work has done. Now, it is interesting because again, that's the diversity of the people participating. I no doubt that's not the diversity of thought, because that's an important part. Now he moves on to say the organization's leadership, particularly Andre Arco, have demonstrated that they are unwilling to communicate with wider members of the community to fix valid concerns. Now, I won't go over all of this guy's points, but basically he points out that quite a few times Andre has advocated for some suspicious ideas. Like, here you go, board minutes indicating that Andre advocated rate limiting access to rubygems.org. Now note that rubygems.org is a separately hosted application. It's basically like a library for developers. So when they're working with Ruby, they can find different tools to use for Ruby on RubyGems. There's lots of other versions for other languages. Now it goes on to say, it advocated rate limiting access to RubyGems.org for users who did not pay Ruby Together. Because Ruby Together are just contributing to RubyGems. They're not running it. Now that becomes a big deal later on. Licensing schemes that would require companies of a certain size to pay Ruby Together for using its portfolio of open source projects was also proposed. I'm going to move on to this other point here. they wanted to send out some messages to people. This message here was submitted saying, Bundler and RubyGems.org are free for anyone to use, but maintaining them costs more than $20,000 every month. If you make a profit using Ruby, help us cover those costs so we can keep the gem ecosystem free for everyone. Now, they're suggesting here that in order to keep Ruby gems free, you need to contribute to rubytogether.org. Even though Ruby Together do not actually keep it running, they just help contribute. There's many other contributors. And there's this other message here as well, where it said here, Bundler is maintained by Ruby Together, a grassroots initiative committed to supporting the critical Ruby infrastructure you rely on. Contribute today as an individual, or even better, as a company, and ensure that Bundler, Ruby Gems, and other shared tooling is around for years to come. Now, again, they're suggesting that they are the ones keeping it alive, keeping it going. Now, they might be helping seriously, but they're not the ones keeping it alive. They don't host it, they don't run it, they don't maintain it. Well, they kind of maintain it, but other people maintain it too. Now, who is Andreyarko? This guy suggested all these rate limiting schemes and is high ranking. Well, this chap here, SW Roble, I came across a comment of his on a Hacker News, which is definitely worth checking out if you're into technology. And he says here, I would just like to point out how supremely infuriating it is to learn that Bundler takes an argument where very clearly specified number. So basically, he's complaining here. He's complaining about some tech issues he's had. Indirect, who is Andreyarko, has said here, really? You came here to be mad about something that we already agree is bad and already fixed 6 months ago? So he's just saying, you're complaining for no reason. But then here he says, additionally, your tone here is outside what's allowed by our code of conduct. Please stop so you won't have to take any enforcement action. The Bundler Code of Conduct is the Contributor Covenant. Sure, we're surprised by that. So, SW Roble says here, I've just read your entire code of conduct. Not sure how any of what I said could possibly be considered in violation of that. Did I somehow make a casual mention of slavery or indentured servitude? So he's actually just saying here, he's taking the piss out of some of these interesting lines in the code of conduct that say things here. Okay. So we've got here the usual use of sexualized language, casual mention of slavery or indentured servitude, or false comparison of one's occupation or situation to slavery. Please consider using or asking an alternative terminology when referring to such metaphors in technology. Making light of or making mocking comments about trigger warnings and content warnings. And then there's some very interesting ones here. Any of the above things, even when presented as ironic or joking, Carl Benjamin would be in trouble there. Any attempt to present reverse-isms versions of above as violations. Example of reverse-isms are reverse racism, reverse sexism, heterophobia, and cisphobia. Unsolicited explanations under the assumption that someone doesn't already know it. Ask before you teach. Don't assume what people's knowledge gaps are. So, this is like an extreme version of the Contributor Covenant, actually, because it's got a lot more in there. But this guy's obviously taking the piss out of it. He's saying, did someone make a casual mention of slavery? Now, he did a follow-up with, sorry, man. I was really annoyed because I was late to this party. I apologize for venting here. Now, Andreyarko responds, I appreciate the apology, and I understand that software can definitely be frustrating when it behaves in unexpected and undesired ways. Since you seem to have missed it completely, let me reproduce the exact part of the code of conduct that you are violating. So the part that he's violated is using welcoming and inclusive language, being respectful of differing viewpoints and experiences, gracefully accepting constructive feedback. And I think it's these next two, focusing on what is best for the community, showing empathy and kindness towards other community members. And then Andre says, responding to a warning with, "Did I somehow mention slavery?" counts as doubling down. So you're getting a 24-hour block. Any future violations will result in a permanent block. And then this guy here, Behard Vixen, responds, this is the perfect example of someone letting the tiniest bit of power go to their head. So you got to wonder, how much further would Mr. Andrearco go? Well, never mind the 24-hour block. Turns out that he took it a bit further. So SW Roble, or actually his name is Stefan Roble, says here, he tweeted last year in April, credit to @indirect, who is Andrearco, Indirect's pettiness for convincing me to cancel my Ruby Together membership. Some people just can't resist a good power trip. When you're right, you're right. And he's responding to DHH, who is the guy who wrote that article, I believe. Yes, he's the guy who wrote that article, Why I Refuse to Fund Ruby Together. And then he says here, he's added on, for the proverbial record, this is literally my joke about slavery, which so offended Indirect. Not sure how any of what I said could possibly be considered in violation of that. Did I somehow make a casual mention of slavery or indentured servitude? And I don't actually see a picture related to that. I assume he's actually, that's his joke there. So, yeah. These are the kind of people who are behind the contributor covenant. That's one person anyway. I'm going to take some time to research into the other people. Now, I noticed something new. I found something new, and I think it's definitely worth mentioning, looking into. Something called the Post-Meritocracy Manifesto. This is just sort of a footnote. This is another little manifesto type code of conduct written by Caroline. It says here, meritocracy is the founding principle of the open source movement, and the ideal of meritocracy is perpetuated throughout our field in the way people are recruited, hired, retained, promoted, and valued. But meritocracy has consistently shown itself to mainly benefit those with privilege, to the exclusion of the underrepresented people in technology. The idea of merit is in fact never clearly defined. Rather, it seems to be a form of recognition, an acknowledgement that this person is valuable insofar as they are like me. Now that's a load of rubbish. It is time that we as an industry abandon the notion that merit is something that can be measured, can be pursued on equal terms by every individual, and can ever be distributed fairly. Now, I would argue that meritocracy is literally the definition of fair distribution based on your contribution. You shouldn't just deserve it because you're there. And here Carlin talks about post-meritocracy. What does a post-meritocracy world look like? It is founded on a core set of values and principles, an affirmation of belonging that applies to everyone who engages in the practice of software development. And no doubt it is utopian and will result in shitty software. I'll leave a link to that post-meritocracy manifesto in the video, as well as any of the other links I've got here. If you want to learn more about it, check them out, or just leave a comment down below, and I'll try and provide any information where I can. I'm going to do a bit more research into Ruby Together, and hopefully uncover some dirty secrets. I'm sure there's plenty to go around, because these SJWs usually don't have they've got plenty of skeletons usually. Anyway, that's everything from me. Hope you enjoyed the video. Went on a lot longer than I expected, but I hope it was enlightening. As a software developer, a lot of this stuff alarms me to a great degree because I worry about what tools I have. But, if it comes down to it, I'll just go back to using the old school 80s scripting languages. Anyway, that's everything from me. Bye.